Hi, this is Kyle Higgins, and you're listening to the Geekcast Radio Network.
Welcome to the Comic Concierge Podcast, a podcast where we feel comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Today, I am joined by a very special guest from the first-time watchers. Tim, how's it going, man?
It is going well. Thanks for having me come on.
Thank you for taking time out to join me on this ever-eventful venture to look behind the curtain. This is actually the first ever recording episode of the Comics Concierge, so we are breaking new ground. So congratulations on this landmark achievement, I should say.
I'm honored, and I'm glad I'm your guinea pig.
Yes. I appreciate that. For those that don't know, like I mentioned, Tim is from the First Time Watchers Podcast. A podcast I highly recommend. I love the concept. It's such a simple concept that makes a lot of sense, where you come together for the most part for the movie you're watching for the first time and give your thoughts and opinions. And it's always fun discussion, your trailer hitches and things of that nature. And I've been on it a few times myself. Mm-hmm. We've talked Star Wars. We've talked classic films, so it's a good cast to listen to if you're a movie fan, and that's why I brought you on here, because you're not typically a person that reads a lot of comics, and that's where I want to kind of start things off, is just in the medium of comics. I know if you watch comic book films, what is your experience with comics going into this little experiment?
Not a lot, to be honest with you. Very limited. Growing up, I did not gravitate towards comics or comic books or graphic novels as a medium. Growing up, it was mostly just TV and movies. And if I read any comics, it may have just been something that was handed to me, something that was lying around at a friend's house. I may have picked it up at a bookstore or something, just because there was nothing else to occupy my time, so it was very limited. Like one Batman comic, one Spider-Man comic, like literally one issue, way back in the day. I vaguely remember some sort of Batman comic, like a paperback book, I think it was, and probably was a collection of issues that were put together into a paperback, and that was probably when I was like in third grade, and there was like a book fair at the school or something like that, so it was nothing that ever grabbed my attention. As I got older, I think I began to respect the medium more, simply because people I knew would talk about them, and I just wouldn't have that background, that experience, so if anything, maybe it's more recently, within the past several years, that I've kind of shown more, at least more of a passing interest in them.
You mentioned a lot of superhero comic. When you think of comics, that tends to be where your mind goes, is the idea of superheroes.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it hasn't been until recently, when, you see a lot more adaptations in movies of more mature material, and then realizing, hey, wait a minute, there's a bunch of graphic novels and comics out there that aren't superhero related, that aren't, that are much more adult oriented material, specifically, something like the one that we're going to talk about today, but even more so, even straddling the fence, that does have adult material with superhero or social commentary, like Watchmen and stuff like that. So, it's just, like I said, you become more aware of these, like when the Watchmen movie comes out, I'm not aware that it's based off of source material. So when I start reading about that, I'm like, oh, that was a comic book. I never heard about that because it wasn't a mainstream Spider-Man, Batman, Superman type of comic, so it's just, I think movies and the movie industry also kind of helps open your eyes to some other source material like this,
And that's very true. And I think there's a lot of movies people don't even realize are based on comics. Something like Blue the Warmest Color is actually based on a comic book, or Road to Perdition, or
History of Violence.
History of Violence. A lot of those, they don't screen comic books. They don't really bring that to the forefront as much as others. There's no, logo in front of Blue the Warmest Color letting you know it's a Marvel film or something like that. It's
right.
It tends to just be influenced by it. But yeah, and I agree with you. I was very much in your same boat, honestly, until like the last 5-6 years, and I was always more of a superhero comic book fan first, and I've recently, I would say, got into more of the realm of other books, and which led me to kind of the recommendation of the book that I presented to you today, and that's The Fade Out by Ed Brubaker. And I wanted to kind of explain why I recommended this to you. So before we got into this podcast, I sent Tim basically a survey to complete, and listening to your podcast, knowing your overall opinions on things, I was trying to get something that I felt like would interest you. And honestly, The Fade Out is typically the first book I recommend to anyone's a fan of film, because it so much takes place in the world of Hollywood, especially classic Hollywood. And Ed Brubaker, right, honestly, is one of my current favorite writers. And if you may have actually experienced some of his work without even realizing it. For example, Captain America Winter Soldier is based upon a story he wrote when he was writing for Marvel. The comic itself is much different than the actual film. There is some bare bones that it resembles, but also he's worked with Westworld, the HBO series. He's been a head writer in that as well. He's getting his hands wet in the world of Hollywood more and more. But I think his bread and butter, what he's best known for, is his crime books. Fade Out is one of his most recent. He has Criminal and a few others. I know you've had some interest in crime based upon your responses, and knowing that you've had some inkling with superheroes, I wanted to see if I could provide a book that is out of that realm, to kind of, like you mentioned, show more of the adult side, more of the more complex storytelling that exists in that of comic books. And the partnership of Sean Phillips and Ed Brubaker, who wrote the story, Sean Phillips is the author, is one of the most popular, one of the most well respected. So I felt it's a good introduction. And there's also nothing else you need to know about this book going into it. It's not tied to continuity of anything else. It's just a self-contained story that you can kind of come in fresh and not have to worry about it. And so you read the first 4 issues of the... Correct. Yeah, great. Of this, and I provided you the issues too. I don't know if I think this is actually really good to read in issues, because there's also, which it's not pertaining to the story, but at the end of each issue, Ed Brubaker also writes a lot of essays on the history of Hollywood with a lot of great information about just things that went on during the time that inspired kind of the story he's telling. But bottom line is, I was curious, what your overall thoughts and impressions were regarding the first volume of The Fade Out.
It's funny, we're talking about, my main interest has always been and continues to be kind of movies and TV, and that's exactly what I see in this. I see Hollywood noir that I've seen countless times. The easiest reference is LA Confidential, especially with the group of characters, here. Even a little bit of Hail Caesar, when you think of the studio chief and this head of security, that kind of thing, those relationships. So, it's hard for me to separate those two while reading this, and continuing on with the stories. I'm thinking to myself, I don't really see anything completely original. I see a comic that I think is influenced by Hollywood, so it's an interesting reversal. And it's just always kind of tough for me to put myself in the headspace of reading a comic like this, because if I'm going to read, I'm going to read a novel, and to me, you see, reading a novel to me, I think, is more fulfilling and entertaining, because what's left in these graphic novels, what's left in the blank spaces in between the lines is the drawings and the scenery and the colors. And to me, I think I prefer what's in my mind while I'm reading and what's being described to me in a novel than what I'm being shown here. I'm not trying to, you know, specifically say this one in particular, but other novels and comics I've read in the past as well. You know, I think it goes for the whole medium is that I prefer the imagery that is created in my mind versus the one that's drawn in front of me. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly understand that. I get like it's kind of when you see an adaptation of a movie of something that you've read and it typically doesn't live up to what your expectations are. Certainly, that's challenging. And I think the first 4 issues of the Fade Out do very much kind of fall in line with something of that. It's not necessarily, like you mentioned, breaking necessarily new ground. I think it does as it evolves moving forward. Ed Brubaker is really, he tends to be a type of writer that likes to kind of get you settled and let you be comfortable, letting you know where you think things are going to go, and like, okay, see, I get where we're going, and then
that's an interesting thing to me too. Is also I'm kind of like also trying to put myself in the headspace. Okay, what if I'm somebody who is into this stuff and I am going to read these and these books, these volumes, you know, this what chapter 1 is what it's called, I guess, or part 1, whatever it is, you know, 39 pages long, but the story itself is maybe about 29 to 32 pages long, and how much does it cost? Does it cost what, like $6, maybe up to $13 to buy?
No, an issue costs $2.99, $3.99, depending.
Okay,
anywhere around there.
All right, so I'm also trying to put myself in the headspace of the person who's gonna purchase this on a regular basis to continue with the stories, and is the monetary output worth the, you know, is the investment worth it, you know, for the entertainment value? And this first, like you said, you're just getting set into this world, you know, and it's a very, you know, bird's eye view of who these people are, you know, at first, you know, and I'm just thinking to myself, I don't know, I could spend the same amount of money renting a movie. I hate to keep comparing it to a movie, you know, but it's really my only experience, you know. So, you know, I could spend the same amount of money renting a movie and for 2 hours get this whole story that's going to be covered in how many 14 issues or more of these graphic novels, you know. So, but you know, when it comes down to the basis of, you know, reading and looking at the story, I you know, like I said, you know, I'm immediately transported to other, you know, material that I'm familiar with. So but as it continues along, you know, into 2, 3, and 4, you know, it is interesting how he does interweave all these other characters, you know, and it kind of, you know, builds up on the story and the mystery. And so I do appreciate the effort put into it, but it's also, I don't know, you know, once again, from my own perspective of, you know, not being immersed in this medium, you know, I'm also looking at the structure of the story and how it does seem to go back and forth in time. You know, there's some nonlinear aspects of the story that I get kind of is a bit jarring to me because there's no clear delineation in those time shifts. And it was a little bit hard for me to follow at times, you know, in the shifts, especially considering really there's not much, even a change in color palette. You know, there's a couple of like those cool panels of the, you know, like the misty, you know, smoke, you know, covering a face or whatever that you know has the voiceover panels in on there too, and those are really, you know, distinctive and different from all the other, you know, more sharply drawn panels as well. So, you know, while those did help, I think some of the other shifts in time, you know, were a little bit more harder to follow. So it took me another couple of panels to realize, oh, wait a minute, you know, we're going back to a memory and stuff like that. So I don't know, it could probably be just me and my inexperience with this medium, you know.
I could see that because Sean Phillips is a very particular sensibility when it comes to the way he sets up his panels, and there is a very distinct way of reading comics. It's something that I'm still kind of learning too.
Yeah.
And you mentioned like how a novel you're able to basically form your own photo, your own image in your own head, and how that sometimes you can't necessarily replicate that in something like a comic. I think what I'm learning too, as I'm kind of diving deeper into comics, is how comics relate more in the way they use paneling far more to that of film, and how similar to the way a panel is structured is very similar to the way a director places his camera, or when it comes to pacing, it's very much impacted by the way in which someone chooses to use their panel. Like the basic comic grid is a classic nine image grid where there's 9 pages and 9 images on the page, and you kind of place your things throughout, and then through time that's really been changing. Some people still use that classic 9-page grid, and sometimes you can see that. I think what Sean Phillips says, he doesn't necessarily use that a lot, and I think without kind of that uniformity throughout his pages, there isn't much. Like if you're coming into this fresh, not really reading comics a lot, I could see why there would be some challenging trying to understand the flow of the story and how things will page to page.
Yeah, I will say that I was going to say that the paneling structure of this it did help me. Actually, I did like it because it is rather uniform. You know, you're right. There isn't 9 on every single page, but you know, I never had any trouble following it. I do remember other comics I've seen in the past where, like on one page, you would have like 2 to 3 panels, you know, like 2 really large ones and 1 really small one, and then on the next page there would be maybe 9 or 7, and then they would be all different sizes. So I think others that I've seen were much harder to follow because I didn't know where my eye should flow to. You know, I never had a problem with these of, you know, following a direction, you know. So I don't think there was really an issue with that. I think it might have been just the literal storytelling, you know.
So just after this, you know, the 4 issues that you've read, do you feel like there are pieces because of that you maybe missed and weren't fully grasping because you were just trying to understand where you are in the story that may have impacted your enjoyment?
Possibly, but I don't think that was really it. I don't think that's what took away from my enjoyment. I think I got used to it as the volumes went on. But I think it was more so the actual meat and substance within the stories, that, you know, and I don't think that I don't know. Maybe if each volume was maybe double the length, I would have been more able to get engrossed in the story, you know, because as I'm turning the pages, I'm like, okay, you know, I still don't have a lot of story, or we didn't cover that much territory in the last, you know, 2 to 3 pages. And I'm looking at the pages go by and thinking how much there is left. And I'm like, gosh, you know, they have to do something before, you know, we get to the next volume. And I'm like, okay, well, now that we get to the next volume, I don't know. I was also, you know, I'm reading this digitally. I'm reading it on my computer. So I'm also trying to imagine what is it like physically holding it, you know, handling it in my hand, and I'm flipping the pages, and I'm trying to think, you know, would I feel like I'm getting the best bang for my buck, you know? And I'm not sure if with this story and its structure, if I would feel I would be getting a worthwhile enjoyment for the money that I might put down, you know, if I was invested in this and I wanted to continue to read it, you know, because I'm, you know, each one, you know, ends on a cliffhanger, you know, on a little note saying, oh, there's, you know, it says to be continued, and there's more, you know, there's, you know, the first one ends with him holding the girl's panties, you know. It's like, oh my gosh, you know, where's it going to go from here, you know? Which is
a problem we all run into.
Exactly. But you know, the overall cliffhanger nature of it, I guess you can't get around it with a continuous story of a multi-volume issue that you need to have a hook. You need to have people continue to read it, you know, and have a reason for people to read it. So you want that person to be like, oh, I need to know what happens with this. So, you know, in a way I can't fault them for it, but to me it feels it feels kind of cheap, you know. But once again, I can't. It's hard for me to even separate myself from the reality of the situation, you know. So, but I just wonder, like, am I getting the bang for my buck? Am I getting everything, you know? But I don't know, you know. I have no point of reference to for other materials to say, oh, you know, maybe somebody else is reading it and saying, oh, I totally got my.
Mm-hmm. Well, so the first volume that you read, the first four issues of the first volume, which runs around like I said, it's like $2.99 for an actual issue, cheaper if you have a subscription, and for entire volume, it's actually like $10 is usually the going rate for a volume for when it comes to Image, and that's what kind of goes into like the industry aspect of comics. And you mentioned like the cliffhangers of each episode, end of each issue. In a way, that's something. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I think a lot of comic book readers, when comics don't have that and don't have that cliffhanger, you tend to get the other end, where a lot of comic readers tend to be upset about that because they want that cliffhanger at the end of each issue. It's kind of expected in a way, and none of all Ed Brubaker's stuff does that, to be honest. Right now, his series that he's doing, Kill or Be Killed, which is much different than this. It doesn't necessarily have that for the most part. It's there on occasion. It's similar to like you would for most television shows, where most television shows tend to end on a point in which kind of makes you want to go on to the next one.
Right.
The other benefit, just the pay aspect, is this is also there's a service called Comixology Unlimited, which this is free for the first 2 volumes. So then you don't even have to worry about at the aspect of the payment version of it. As long as it's like a Netflix subscription for comics, basically. And they have a variety of different ones from Image, Marvel, no DC though, weirdly enough. But and you mentioned the thing of the physical aspect of it too, which is, I think, is a huge debate in the world of comics when it comes to reading them, because there's a lot of people who, like, I have a lot of friends who would not read digital comics. It has to be the physical form of it because they like holding the comic. There's also like an odd smell to the comic, and I think in truth it's a different experience too in the way you view the art, because how art looks like on the computer screen obviously looks very much different on the printed page when you have something that's gone through printing press and what that looks like. And it's I think a lot of comic book artists are still struggling with kind of finding a medium in which it can work really well in both, especially when it comes to things like the coloring and how different that is. Because, you know, it wasn't that long ago when it was all just done physically, you know, through it didn't move digitally coloring until like the last decade or so, and there's been a pretty big learning curve, and some of it done really well. I think Sean Phillips' group tends to do really good. I forget who does the coloring for it, but that in itself is very much a art aspect when it comes to comics, because you have the person who does the pencils, the person who does the inking afterwards, and then the colorist who very much can greatly impact the actual comic itself and the way it looks and feels, for sure. So
another concern I would have, if I didn't know up front, I would need to know up front, does this have an end story? Does it have an actual end? Will everything be resolved by however many volumes they put out or decide to put out? So if I got invested in a story like that, because what I vaguely know about most like superhero comics is it's always a continuing storyline. It's like a never-ending thing, or it can always be rebooted or stuff like that. So that would hinder my desire to even think of getting invested in certain issues of superhero comics, because it really doesn't matter. There is no end game. I would want to know in something like this, is there an end game? You know what I mean?
Yeah. For this, there is an end game. This series is actually finished. There's been 3 volumes, 12 issues total, and it's done. There may be like future installments, but it would be like something like, think of like Amityville Horror or something like that, where the next volume is a different set of characters. It's just with the same title. And the benefit of so this is produced by Image Comics, which is the largest independent publisher of comics. You have Marvel, DC, Image is right there. And they've really spearheaded the creator-owned book. So Ed Brubaker, Sean Phillips, they actually own this title, and so there's no one, like, Image can't take this and reboot it with different writers or use it how they see fit. It actually has to be done by Brubaker unless he lets someone else take it over. And most of his books do typically all have an endpoint. Most of them don't go, I think, for the most part, when it comes to creator owned, don't go beyond 50 issues or so. I think going into this, it was already announced the 12 issue maxi series, which is kind of the standard length, a story of this nature, one issue per month, for around a year or so, give or take some breaks in between. So this luckily you don't have that problem with, like you mentioned, when it comes to like a Marvel or DC. That's a whole other bag, because a lot of those characters are not they're not going to stop making Spider-Man comics. They're going to keep trying to make those, but a benefit of something like this is that you don't have that problem. It's very much in the hands of the creator, which is why we're getting, typically when you look at like the best comics, the awards, they're typically going to the creator-owned comics, because they have that freedom. They can pretty much do what they want. There's no editorial really, and they just use Image as more of they kind of partner with them to produce their comic.
You had mentioned briefly the colors, and the drawings and whatnot, and that's one thing that stuck out to me is I wasn't that impressed with the drawing. I like the color palette, the colors that are used overall. I like how they, there's a constant shift essentially from page to page. There's, one set that has a lot of greens and a little blue, and the next one there's purples that are introduced, and then there's, very muted earth tone, and then it goes into, a more warm blue, reds and oranges and yellows, and then shifts again back to green and blues. And I like that, but I don't think that the art style is that great. I also don't think there's enough shadow used. If you're trying to emulate this noir era and get this noir feel, I don't think there's a lot of enough shadow work in this,
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. I gotta say, like, that's something I adore Sean Phillips as an artist, because I think what he does better than most when it comes to the frame of is his storytelling ability and how his acting when it comes to his characters. So it's not necessarily, I could see what you're saying. It's not a very dark comic per se when it comes to that, but I don't know. I don't know if that's a choice on his part, but it wasn't something that I thought of when I was reading it. I felt like it was representation of kind of the story that he was telling, and I think what's really, like I mentioned, is he has a really good ability to, like, you can see it when you watch, you'll notice it when you can see artists who aren't able to do that, when it is demonstrate emotion in the framework of their characters in a way that's not obvious. And there are some times where it is, but I don't know. I get it's not very flashy is not the right word, but it's not necessarily, you're not going to take a page out of this and like make a poster out of it.
Oh no, not at all. Yeah,
but I thought when it comes to a storytelling technique, I enjoy what he does.
The most recent comic experience I have is Frank Miller's Dark Knight series, and I read that a couple of years ago. And there's a lot, of course, there's a lot that stands out about that. From the storytelling. Well, I'll even say, the storytelling, once again, it's not the strongest point of that thing for me, probably because of my inexperience with the medium. But obviously the art style is amazing in that. And I probably had that in my mind, considering it's the most recent thing that I've read from a couple of years ago. I read it before, Batman vs. Superman, just for a little bit of, backstory, but I really dug the art style and the use of shadow in that, and it's necessary for the character of Batman too, consider. But I just thought that I think maybe shadow could have been utilized a little bit more in this, considering some of the mood that they're trying to evoke in this,
Makes sense. Yeah, I mean, that's tough when you're trying to follow up The Dark Knight when it comes to it.
I know. It's probably not the fairest comparison.
Yeah. One thing I would, to skip ahead, but if you're looking for something that's very similar, that is in the realm of crime, that is very different. I mean, I'm guessing you've seen the Sin City film, I would assume. Yeah. The downside of what I tend to not want to recommend Sin City the comic is because if you've watched the movie, you've read the comic, because it legitimately is page for page just on the screen. So it's like you're not necessarily getting that much out of it. It's like reading the novel version of a movie you've already watched pretty much. So it's worth it because the art is like Frank Miller, when he was Frank Miller and not what he is now, it was a genius in when it comes to that, no doubt. And I think he's on one end where, say, something like Sean Phillips is on a very different end when it comes to the way he does his comics, where it does not have that get out and grab you type of look to it. It's very mundane, and so I could see why it would not necessarily be as impressive as something of the nature of a Dark Knight or other major comics. Anything else you wanted to talk about regarding the comic? Anything else that you did enjoy that you didn't talk about, or anything else that you had questions about?
I don't know if I had any questions about anything. I just think I did appreciate the growing cast as it went along, similar to maybe like a TV series. You get more invested in some of the characters, you get involved in other aspects of other people's lives, and you get a little bit more as it goes along. So getting more invested in this world and these people is certainly interesting. It's funny. There's even in the second issue the idea of don't get any flame near the nitrate, of the film, and it's just like it's something like, oh yeah, I saw that in Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, so, but even then Tarantino's riffing on stuff there as well, so who knows where he got that from, but it's just so many things that reminded me of movies. I'm even kind of looking at the characters and their drawings. I'm like, oh, who would play this guy or who would play this girl? So if they ever adapted it,
Yeah. Or at times where you legitimately have actual actors show up, like Clark Gable and stuff like that.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's so, that kind of takes me out of it, to be honest with you. I understand it's in this real world, but when you literally bring in Clark Gable and he's drawn exactly, it's almost like Uncanny Valley, because they're trying to draw him like he really is, but all these other people are so much more expressive and drawn in such great mannerisms at certain times, like when they have this argument in the cemetery, his friend, who was blacklisted, there's a lot of great, expressions there on the faces. But, when you bring in Clark Gable, it feels so flat,
I could see, it's funny because it's
strange.
like you see it a lot too anytime, like Marvel right now has a Star Wars comics, and that problem happens so much because they try to replicate actual, like, Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill and stuff like that, and it looks, you do have that very it's flat impression where like you're looking at something that just looks wrong. So yeah. I could understand how that would impact your overall enjoyment. So I think on my end, what I maybe made a mistake is that when it comes to recommendation is maybe not necessarily going something that you would be able to directly relate to something you're already well known, but maybe something that is a little bit more off the wall, a little bit that is kind of a more brand new experience. But so looking at like possible other recommendations, if you had any interest in comics, something that you might enjoy. So one thing that comes to mind that is a self-contained story altogether. So it's an original graphic novel that came out all at once recently this year is My Favorite Thing is Monsters, currently available on, like I mentioned, Comixology Unlimited, and honestly probably best bet going to the library because it's a huge book. It's rather expensive. I don't think you would read that and necessarily relate it to anything per se, but the person who wrote it is basically telling the story of a young girl who grew up in Chicago in the 1960s, but also has this love affair with monster movies and monsters. And she draws the girl like as a monster, and like it kind of goes through her viewpoint and how she sees life and how it impacts the way she see things. And it's unlike anything I've read this year. It's probably going to be getting the Eisner Award, or at least a nomination, which is the kind of the Oscars of the comics medium. There really isn't necessarily a panel per se. It's the way the layout is very different. It's maybe challenging because it's sometimes I found it hard to follow in the sense of where you go, but I also found it like endlessly fascinating, and I think that is something where you would be blown away by the art because it's. I was also trying to get something that would kind of correlate to your love of Geostorm, but I think I couldn't really find anything per se that would live up to the hype of that. So
nothing could ever live up to the hype of Geostorm.
So I didn't like. I wasn't even going to try. I wasn't even going to go down that route. So, but like if you weren't, if you know this doesn't do it for you when it comes to kind of the crime element, I would steer away from that. But there are other image books out there that you may enjoy, like Deadly Class, which we're actually making a TV show of very soon. That is kind of the kid assassin thing that's just, it's very different in the sense of the it takes place in the 80s. Art's really unique. Has kind of a like very 1980s grungy feel to it, like very punk of period in the way that it's replicated. But I do want to again thank you for taking the time to read, because I know when it comes to comics, it's hard to find a time to do it. I know you have a lot of movies you have to watch and other things you need to take care of. So.
No, I mean, honestly, I had a good time. I'm glad that, you introduced this to me. I think your concept here is great, and I was happy to do it. I found it interesting, and for the 4 issues that you gave me here, there were. I read them all at once, and it took me maybe 40 minutes to go through. And I didn't feel like I wasted my time. Please don't feel like that, because I legitimately did enjoy the experience, but I also wonder if it's something that I would continue to do, and it would probably be something that would have to capture my interest on it would probably be something that would probably even capture many people's interest and say, oh, you have to read this, you have to take a look at this. And I'd be like, oh, okay, it would probably be more of a recommendation like this, like what you have done, versus me seeking it out. You know what I mean?
Makes sense. So what you're saying is I just need to have you on again and recommend something else, and just keep
absolutely
picking away.
I would be happy to.
Definitely. Well, I definitely again appreciate it. So. So that overall is the Fade Out. Is available on many different platforms. As mentioned, you can get. I think they're actually coming out with deluxe hardcover that has everything in one fell swoop. But that's pretty much it for today. So, Tim, do you want to go? I know we talked about your podcast beforehand, but if people wanted to hear more from you or listen to your podcast, where could they do that?
You can find everything you need to know at patreon.com/firsttimewatchers. You can follow us on Twitter at 1STTimeWatchers. Always have a pin tweet there, the latest episode. We're approaching 300 episodes, so there's tons to choose from. If you dare, if you want to hear the three of us, stumble about our thoughts on a particular movie or whatever. But it's a good time. Anybody who wants to listen, let us know what you think.
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, I've been on. I'm a regular listener, and you guys have recommended. I've been able to listen to or watch a lot of films for the first time because of listening to your podcast and hearing good things. I think I may even dive deep into Geostorm when it hits home media. I missed it in theaters, so unfortunately, but.
You're a loss.
Yeah, I know. It's something it's going to be one of my big regrets in life. But maybe I'll get a second run. You never know.
It's Oscar run. That's right.
Exactly. Well, thank you for listening to the first ever episode of the Comic Concierge Podcast. As we begin this fun experiment, we have a lot of fun episodes in store, including an episode with GCRN's own Kevin Thompson, as well as an episode with JT from In Session Film, and some other things that are in the works. So a lot to look forward to, a lot of comics to talk about. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.